Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all of the above from all over the world. Hello to my friend and colleague, Peter Weill, who is almost diametrically opposite the planet to me as we both sit here today and join you for this LinkedIn Live from MIT Sloan Executive Education. And we've invited Peter Weill to come and talk with us about his research and his work in the field, in this case, of digitally savvy boards. And today's title is Top Performers Have Digitally Savvy Boards and Teams. And we're very excited to learn more about this topic as the next hour or so ensues. This is a LinkedIn Live. It's our intention for it to be very interactive. So please do feel free to add questions and comments in the stream on LinkedIn. I will do my best to keep an eye on those, and if any topics come up that I think Peter might be able to weigh in on, I'll put some of your questions to him as well. But in the meantime, I'd really like to introduce you all once again. You all know from the process of signing up for this event, of course, a lot about Peter, but he's really an incredibly prolific and highly respected leader in the space of research on information systems and IT, and particularly the ways that they impact on business. Peter is a senior research scientist and chair of the Center for Information Systems Research at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He is an author of a number of highly regarded books and publications and papers in that space broadly. He's an incredibly busy chap, and so I'm just delighted that he's been able to spend some time at an unearthly time of day in Australia to sign in with us live and join us for this conversation. So Peter, welcome. I'm glad that you're here, and if you don't mind, maybe what I would like to do, I think I did a very high level and not at all giving justice to the work that you actually do. So perhaps I could start by just saying, better than I just did, would you like to introduce yourself? And in particular, what have you been doing recently at MIT that you're going to be sharing with us today?
Thanks, Peter. And hello, everybody. It's so great to be with you all, and Peter, to collaborate with you again. One thing I'd love you to do in the chat is put in the city you're in and where you are, at a pub, at a cafe, in your bedroom, wherever you are. We'd love to know what city you're in and where you are, so we get a sense of who's on the call. Peter, I'm just about to celebrate my 22nd year at MIT. So I have to say I've died and gone to heaven. MIT is my kind of place, as it is yours. And one of the reasons for it is that MIT has a lot of collaborations and really believes in the mind and hand motto, mens manas. And so I'm the chairman of a research center called the Center for Information Systems Research. We're coming up to our 50th birthday. And we study one thing, really, which is how do bigger, older companies thrive in the next era of technological change. And we have a set of colleagues at MIT CISR who do research on this topic. And you can see on the right-hand side the topics that we're studying at the moment. But please, if you haven't, come to our website. We've just refreshed it, and it's got a lot of our material, research, papers, videos, slide sets, all kinds of things, places for discussion. And the companies that are members, we work with their boards and executive teams and technology leaders, both in the research and also in helping them think about how they should change going forwards. And that's one of the most exciting parts, Peter.
That's great. Thank you. That's a good broad overview. So let's focus in on today's topic. You recently co-authored a couple of, some have thought, quite provocative articles about the digital savviness of boards and top management teams at major corporations. Can you give us sort of the bottom line of what you said in these articles?
Sure. Yeah. We published two articles in last year and the year before that in the Sloan Management Review. And we wanted to know whether, excuse me, boards and the top management teams of companies, the CEO and her or his direct reports, were digitally savvy and ready for the big changes that were going to come in digital business already with us. And so we studied in a very different way, and that's been part of the fun. We used a machine learning methodology based on interviews and surveys. We identified keywords that described or indicated somebody being digitally savvy or not. And then using bios and machine learning, we analyzed the board members and the top management teams, and then correlated that to financial performance. So it also made me realize that, research is being disrupted, because this is not a survey, it's a population study. We studied every board listed in the United States with over $1 billion in revenue, and learned a lot of things. So what I thought I'd do, because I've got some numbers, I'll show you a couple of slides, but I'd love it to be a conversation, Peter. A couple of things we learned. Firstly, only about a quarter of boards in the US with over $1 billion in revenue were digitally savvy. And I'll define what I mean by that in a moment, but just wanted to give you the top line. And those boards, the companies that those boards were involved with, just performed way better. 38% higher revenue, and you can see higher ROA, higher market cap growth. And one of the things we learned, is that you needed to have 3 digitally savvy directors. If you only had one, we didn't see a pop in the performance. And when we interviewed a bunch of chairs, and in fact, we did this research with my colleague, Stephanie Warner at MIT CISR, and 2 board chairs of listed companies, Jenny Banner and Tom Appel. And we interviewed a whole lot of chairs, and here's what we learned. What they said was, yeah, when we have one digitally savvy director, we pat ourselves on the back, but no one really listens to them. They're a lone voice. So then we brought a second one on. Still no pop in the statistics in terms of impact on performance or correlation to performance. But as the chairs said, they talk to each other a lot, and we didn't quite follow what they were saying, but they got on really well. And it was only when we got to 3 that we had this major change in the conversation, the culture, and we see that in other areas too, diversity of all kinds. And that last point on the slide is probably a good indicator. What happens when you have digitally savvy directors is it changes the risk conversation from sort of reviewing all the projects, the traffic light review, to understanding the business model risk of not doing something different. And so that's the big change we see, Peter.
That's interesting. And we'll come back, I think, in a minute to something I think I heard you say that suggested that you've become digitally savvy as a team in some interesting ways as well, and how you conduct the work. But actually taking a step back, you mentioned this. How do you define digital savviness?
Yeah.
What is it? How do people know if they've got it? And does it show up in the same way in all roles and different industries?
It's a great point. The way we define digitally savviness is 4 elements. One is that, and we're not seeing your camera, Peter. Just if.
Yeah, I'm just going to try and switch to another camera. This one.
Okay, no problem. So there are 4 elements we found that were important in digitally savviness, and everyone on the call, I'd love you to rate yourself firstly, and then the members of your board or top management team. We're going to apply the same lens to top management teams in a moment. But the first one on the left is understanding, tested by experience, how digital impact company success in the next decade or so. So how confident are you that you could spell that out? And in fact, it's one of the questions I always ask board members and top management teams, because listening to that gives you a really good sense of their vision of how the company's going to change. And then what is the organizational change required to get there? So that's the first, top left. Bottom left is a good enough understanding, perhaps not MIT lab level, but good enough understanding of technology itself. What's a platform? I would have to tell you, Peter, the word platform and ecosystems for that matter have so many different definitions. You get 6 people in the room, you'll get 7 definitions of both of those things. So a common language is very important at the board level, as it is in the top management team. And so what's the technology potential? So platforms, AI, big data, IoT, smart fabrics, whatever it is that's important for your own business. And then what does that mean in terms of business models, partnering, customer experience, risk, cyber risk, and so on. The third one, and this is usually the hardest, is understanding when to commit, when to partner, what are early indications of success and challenges, and how do you get to scale once you've shown that this approach works. And we'll talk a little later about measures and benchmarks and, more importantly, dashboards. But that third one is a big, I think, challenge for many organizations. And then the last one is the whole idea that we're no longer going to have an IT department or a digital department. The whole business will be digitally savvy. When I go into companies and talk to them who are digitally savvy, I can't tell who's in IT, who's in the mortgage business, who's in the energy business. Everyone has a digitally savvy capability. They're good at using data. And so that whole idea of alignment, we used to study, Peter, alignment, aligning the IT department with that's got to go. And so this is what we mean by digitally savvy.
That's great. Could you give us some specific examples just to help us understand that more?
Yeah, sure. So we've looked at many companies across the globe, and one of the best ways to determine whether they're digitally savvy is looking at their business and how they have changed it over time. And so we identified a series of companies that were both digitally savvy at the top level and top quartile performers on margin and growth. And so you would see in the tech side of the companies that you would expect, Microsoft, for example, that have digitally savvy leaders and also top performance. But we also see lots of other companies who were not tech companies, but have become much more technology enabled in their business. And one of the companies that we've studied is called Schneider Electric. You probably know them. They're about a 30 billion euro company today. They sell originally energy systems or components, products to help manage energy, from HVACs to system thermostats to energy management. And they've moved about half their revenue to IoT enabled selling energy outcomes, energy efficiency. And their customers who use this IoT-enabled system have on average 30% better, lower energy costs. And to do it, you have to link all the products in a company's factory or building or whatever it is to an IoT layer that manages that data in real time and provides advice or even makes decisions on its own. And so we see with companies like Schneider Electric, they have changed their business model to be helping their customers achieve their outputs, not only sell inputs. So instead of just in half their business is selling the products, but the other half is this selling energy efficiency as an outcome. And so it's a very digitally connected business model. You can imagine there's a lot of data, a lot of issues around security, and also it set them up beautifully for customers who now want to manage their carbon footprint, who want to be more energy efficient going forwards. And so that's an example of a company that over the last 7 or 8 years has become increasingly digitally savvy in the whole organization.
Great. And I think you started there talking as well about some, not only examples, but some of the ways that digital savvy companies do things differently. Are there any more that sort of come to mind that are really hallmarks of a digitally savvy company?
Absolutely, yeah. I have a list of 10 elements. Stephanie Warner, who's an amazing data analyst, did this analysis. Before I do it, though, I want to show you how this applies to the top management team. And then I'd like to show you that list of what we call digitally savvy capabilities. So for top management teams, it was even more severe. What we found was that looking at almost all, not quite, the large companies globally that were over 3 billion in revenues, only 7% of them had more than half of the top management team that would have been digitally savvy by our MIT definition. And you can see that the companies that were in that 7% performed way better than their peers, industry adjusted. So very significantly higher growth, margin, and valuations. And it's a linear relationship, or pretty close, so that the more digitally savvy on average, the better the performance on average we see. And so that means, to your point, we really want to understand what it is to be a digitally savvy organization and how we get there. But there was also some really interesting differences by industry. For example, only 12% of the top management teams in financial services were digitally savvy, which is shockingly low. And there's lots of reasons for that. I think financial services have been very engaged in all kinds of compliance issues. And so I think that's changing. The most digitally savvy industries were media and tech companies in the 30 percentiles of senior management that were digitally savvy. The average across the whole world was about 17% of senior executives that were digitally savvy. And it really varied by role, Peter. You and I have talked about this. For example, only half of the CIOs were digitally savvy. And when we looked at this and interviewed people, it was clear that the half that were digitally savvy were leading the change of the organizations, but the other half were traditionally back office operators, folks who were running the systems, but not engaged as much in leading the change. And so CEOs, a quarter of them, marketing directors or CMOs, only about a quarter, 12% of finance CFOs, digitally savvy. So there's a lot of, how do I say this politely, opportunity to increase the digitally savviness of companies.
And thinking about this from the perspective of individuals in these leadership positions and on boards, if you're suggesting, which I think you are, that digital savvy companies had at least 3 board level senior leaders who you would score as digitally savvy out of depends where they were, a dozen, 2 dozen direct board level and senior executives probably in that management group. What are you seeing people are doing? Are they are people who are not currently digital savvy actually acquiring digital savviness at that level? Are people hiring people who are digitally savvy? Is this a development question? Is this an organizational question? And who's actually driving in what you've seen and actually paying for all of that?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above, Peter. So yes, board members, top management team members have recognized there's an opportunity, and individuals, I think, know pretty much where they are on this digital savviness. So there's a lot of education available, for example, around the globe, including in your organization. And so I'm leading with one of your colleagues a program for one of the largest banks in this region, including their board and their top 100 folks on a digitally savvy program. We have done programs for many companies across the globe. In fact, we've just launched an open enrollment program for digitally savvy directors, a certificate. And so we're about to do the first program in Australia in the week after next, and then in Boston during the summer. So yes, huge investment. And what's really interesting for me is that once folks are aware that that's something they want to improve, and we all need to improve our skill sets over time, you see significant improvements and increases. I mean, most board members are inherently curious, and that's the thing that predicts whether someone will become digitally savvy. The four elements I looked at, they may be weighted slightly differently. They may not be as good on the tech, but better on the understanding how to govern. So absolutely, we see that. One of the responsibilities, I think, of senior management teams is to assess how digitally savvy they are. Have an honest conversation about who's digitally savvy, who's not, and how do we change that. And so there's a really strong opportunity for heads of HR and perhaps CIOs to partner to lead that change. And we see in some companies that partnership very effectively invest. And so programs, demos, so at MIT, our motto is mens among us, but I think the real motto, Peter, is demo or die. And I think we can show something, how it works. It really helps. So companies like DBS, probably the best bank in the world by many metrics out of Singapore, had a huge investment in increasing the digital savviness of their own team, including having their experts give lunchtime sessions on particular topics and rated in the app store within the company, and all kinds of hands-on efforts. Another thing they did was they asked the top 200 people to wear a second hat and assess the customer experience in a particular journey. So maybe a journey like when you travel, what happens to your credit card? Does it get denied or not? And so really, I think, explicit efforts to improve the digital savviness. And now we're seeing those kinds of digital savviness get included in 360s, get included in development plans. So it's really ramped up since we published the article just over a year ago.
That's fascinating because you've shown us a few 2x2s during the course of describing this work, and in my mind, I'm seeing now this distinction between the things ultimately that digitally savvy companies are doing in the way their businesses operate and benefiting from being digitally savvy, but sort of the orthogonal and equally important dimension you're describing is what is it that digitally savvy companies do that actually makes them digital savvy in the first place?
Exactly. Yeah. So why don't we take a look at that? This is the slide I mentioned. So if this is the average percent of digital savvy leaders across the globe as of just over a year ago, then there's a lot of opportunity for the kinds of interventions and changes. And you're seeing businesses like Schneider be 50% real-time online businesses, so it's going to be really important to improve that over time. So here we have, there are 10 areas. We looked at a whole lot of things. These were the 10 elements that were the most impactful. And you can see on the right-hand side the green is the top quartile of digital savviness of top management teams, TMTs. And then the bottom quartile in the red. And the differences are just huge. And we see them in three categories. The first is results that statistically predict or correlate with future financial performance. So the one that's the top two ones we always look at, they are how innovative is the company, and particularly using digital, but in general. And we measure that as a percent of revenues from new offerings introduced in the last 3 years. And that highly correlates with future financial performance, particularly growth. And you can see the difference in percent effectiveness for the green and the red companies. That also enables helping the customer meet more of their needs. So more of our products being used by the customer. And also more progress on transforming. And for most companies, transformation is a combination of improving the customer experience as well as improving the operational efficiency. The second set is a group of 3 practices that really differentiate digitally savvy companies from more traditional companies. And when I say them out loud, they just sound obvious, right? But they're really hard to do. If you think about our own organizations to help us do that. So the first one is rapid learning. So how do we learn faster than everyone else? And so do we do test and learn, minimal viable products? How do we share lessons? How do we do an evidence-based decision making? A/B testing, the whole agile teams. The second, and this is something that we have studied for many, many years, and it turns out it's huge difference. You can see on the right-hand side, having a company that's modular, open, and agile predicts statistically better performance, but also you see digitally savvy top management teams understand how to do that. So what are your crown jewels? If you're a bank onboarding a customer, or KYC, or giving a mortgage, those are the crown jewels of banks. And how do we make them modular, reusable, very efficient? How do we connect those to our partners? Because more and more banks are going to be embedded as banking and as a service. And how do we do it in an agile way? And so we see companies like BBVA around the world reorganize themselves around these kinds of platforms and capabilities. And then the last one is to free up our people to do this innovation, to do this rapid learning. We want to automate as many of the decisions as we can, and also make it more and more self-service and learn from those decisions. And so we see a lot of companies focusing on that. And then down the bottom, and this is where, Peter, you and I can hold a mirror up to ourselves and say, so as leaders, how do we help our organizations be better at this? And so moving from command control to coach and communicate, creating a digital culture while still holding people accountable, and freeing up time and encouraging innovation and finding ways to learn from things that don't work. And for me personally, as I sort of reflect on my own journey around digital, the hardest thing for me to change has been, I've always felt that expectation that I should have the answer. Here's what we should do, right? Off we go. And I've learned the hard way that just isn't possible in a digital world. Instead, what we have to do is say, what's the right question? Should we develop a different business model? Just taking my own center at MIT, should we create a go-to destination as an ecosystem, or should we be a modular content provider in other people's relationships with their customers, or both? And so the way to answer that question, I think, is with data, and to test and see what works and what doesn't work in real time. And to do that, you have to be modular, open, and agile. And so you see how the circle goes around and round.
I think it's very powerful set of considerations there, particularly like you've got creating a digital culture as one of the important lines there. I'd love to hear more about what you think that means and looks like, and perhaps you could tell us a bit more about that, particularly in the context you have a new book out, Future Ready, which I think might be quite relevant. I'd love to hear more about that.
We do, yeah. So there are really some interesting challenges around getting to become future ready. And I wanted to show you the cover. It's coming out in September. We're very excited. It's in the sort of copy editing phase. And I wrote this with my colleagues at MIT CISR, Stephanie Warner and Ina Sebastian. Peter, when I look at this picture, I always wonder what my dad is doing up on the cover. It's really pretty funny. But what we identified was that there were really four ways, pathways to get from where you are today to being future ready. And becoming digitally savvy is a vehicle to get there. It's not an end in itself, right? It's the way, one of the ways you become future ready. So I wanted to show you one of the 2x2s that you mentioned that we've had a lot of success with in working with senior management teams. And I'd like to give some examples to show how there are different ways you can go along from where you are today to being future ready. So the 2x2, the vertical dimension is that improving customer experience, again, relative to your competitors. And we measure that in a bunch of different ways. And then operational efficiency, which was all about the things that we discussed of automation, standardization, reuse, employee experience. One of the really big challenges is there's a high correlation between customer experience and employee experience. And so expecting our employees to deliver more and more sophisticated services, but with systems that are not up to it, it's just not possible. So the goal here is future readiness, and we define that with a series of characteristics. There are 10 actually, but very similar to what you saw on that slide. I'll just point out a couple that are really important. One is this ability to be ambidextrous, so with one hand to pull out cost and with the other hand to innovate. And you get this rhythm of pulling out cost and innovating at the same time. And that's a real distinguishing feature of future ready companies. It allows them to create great customer experience, but also typically in a modular way, so a Lego block kind of model. It also finally, and we've been saying this for a long time, and my colleague Barb Wixom, who leads the data research at MIT CISR, has done great research on this, but finally we're seeing data become a strategic asset. And trying to understand how to use data ethically. I mean, one of the things we've noticed is the creepiness line with data is moving, right? What's acceptable for different types of people is different, and it's changing. And also, future ready companies are good at partnering, and not the old-fashioned handshake partnering, but more computer-to-computer partnering in real time. And companies that are better at digital partnering grow faster in our research. And then future ready companies are also ecosystem ready. So they can become that go-to destination, like an Amazon, for example, or be a plug and play provider into someone else's ecosystem. But of course, the problem is that most companies don't start there, right? They start and in the silos and spaghetti bottom left, for good reasons. They're growing fast. They've acquired many companies. They operate globally. And so they have a very complex landscape of systems and processes. And when they perform well, it's because of the heroics of their people, who, despite these poor systems and complexity, make the customer experience work. And we've got all over the company heroes who close the books at the end of the month, or port systems overnight, or whatever they do. And we're burning them out. And that's a part of why we're seeing the great movement of, I think, people across companies looking for better opportunities. So the question becomes, how do you go from silos and spaghetti to future ready? And we found these 4 pathways. So I'll very quickly describe them with some examples. But what's, I think, important is understanding what it takes that to move a company from silos and spaghetti to future ready. So the number one, that sort of hockey stick, is we call industrialization. And that is about moving towards standardization, reuse, simplification, cleaning up the data, moving to the cloud, embedding AI in systems to automate, extracting data. And it has 2 phases. The second phase is really fun, right? Because that hook of the hockey stick, you get really terrific improvements in customer experience. The first phase we call the digitization desert. This is where the CIO or CIO says, no, don't ask for new things because we've got to fix up the mess, and of course, the rest of the organization doesn't want to do that. And so they go off and start independent initiatives to their customers. And if they're not integrated and coordinated, this fails. That first phase is tough. But the good news is the new technologies, microservices, cloud, agile teams, and others have made that digitization desert shorter. The second is the dark blue line that improves the customer experience. And that's fun from day one, right? Here we get teams all over the companies making the customer experience better. And it works. On average, the NPS goes up, the revenue goes up. Everything's good. Well, not really, because what happens is we haven't fixed the underlying problem and we add more complexity, more layers. So at some point you have to turn right. The third one is this stair steps, where you do smaller projects that are more coordinated. And then the fourth one is you say, we just give up. There's no way we can transform the mothership in time. We'll create a born digital unit because it's a different business model, say. And so we see that with neobanks, for example, all over the world. So some examples of companies that have been very successful. Number one, Path One, Tetra Pak, the producer of containers for food, made tremendous progress moving up pathway 1 and now have very, very digital connections to their customers, ability to track and trace their products through from source, what's in the box, the ingredients, the farm, came from right through to recycling. Path 2, Cemex, one of the largest cement companies in the world, created an amazing offering called Cemex Go. They realized that their customers, particularly the people who run construction sites, they sell cement and aggregates and other building products, have a very hard job, which is, it's hard to know when to order, what to order, where the deliveries are. So they created a digital experience that allows the construction manager to identify what products they want, order them, price them, pay for them, and then, like Uber, track the trucks to the delivery. And so they have now a NPS of 67, which is unheard of in the industry. So number 3, DBS, the bank I talked about, followed the stair steps. And 4, we see lots of examples of that. One of my favorites is from Bayer. With their, they have an offering called Climate Field View, which is a offering to farmers to help them through satellite imaging and sensors and software and drones and other things, manage their yield per square meter of their farms. And this has had a tremendous success, has 180 million acres under management now globally. And it has been a path for initiative with a separate business unit. So Peter, that's what we see. It's a question I asked for folks on the call is, which pathway are you on? How's it going?
That's a great question. So people, please feel free to add in the comments as much as you can share. We don't want you to share anything confidential, but tell us a little bit about what you're facing as we're talking. Peter, while that's coming in, you mentioned NPS a couple of times, and clearly, metrics of customer experience are both extremely important and oftentimes hard to come by, particularly in objective and rigorous ways. I'm wondering, what kinds of questions are you asked when you're talking to boards and senior leaders about the work on this book and the work that went before it, other than what's an NPS and why should I care?
Yeah.
What are some of the key questions that you're getting asked?
So one of the key questions is, what does it take to be successful along these pathways, and can we have multiple pathways? And of course, larger organizations do have multiple pathways. The more pathways you're on, the harder the coordination to make them work. And whichever pathway you're on, you have to manage these explosions. These are those organizational changes you have to make. And we call them explosions because that's how they feel. So one of them, for example, is changing decision rights. Because if you don't change the decision rights about who can make key decisions like prioritization, what projects do we do? Or one of the most important is who gets to decide what we do and who gets to decide how we do it. Because if you give the decision rights of what and how to the same group, you're almost guaranteed to get silos and spaghetti. So how do we manage those organizational explosions is one of the questions I get asked all the time. And that's, I think, a problem that goes for some time because those explosions don't go away. Platform mindset is another explosion, new ways of working. Another question I get asked is, do we have to do major organizational change, a big surgery, to get the value from digital? And we think the answer to that is yes, but not early on. It's better to do that kind of organizational change later once you really know where the pain points are. And some of the companies we've seen that have struggled in this transformation have made the surgery early on and not and had to do it again. So questions I get asked from boards and top management teams are, so how do we know that we're getting value, to your point of NPS? And so the book has got a combination of the pathways and value. And we really found some very interesting things in value. We found there's really fundamentally three kinds of value. There's value from operations, there's value from customers, and there's value from ecosystems. And so following any one of the pathways, the value comes in different orders. So for example, pathway one, the value comes first from operations, then customer typically, then ecosystems. And we found some very interesting insights that help companies, I think, capture the value. So we measured how effectively companies are at creating value today from digital. And we looked at many different metrics and of the three types of value. And we found that companies are about 40%, 42% effective relative to the best companies at creating value from digital. So there's still a lot of upside. We also found there was a strong correlation with digital and profit. So digital statistically correlates to 24, or explains, if you like, 24% of profitability relative to industry. And lastly, and this is the part that I think has the most action associated with it, is about half the value created is captured in the bottom line. The other half is captured elsewhere by customers, by partners, or wasted along the way. So measuring that creation and capture of value is in real time is really critical.
That's great. And I was just looking at some of the comments coming in while you were explaining that, Peter, and I'll just try to paraphrase one or two. But I think looking back, Paula asked a question about the companies that you studied. Have you seen them simultaneously pursuing multiple versions, multiple pathways through this 2x2? And maybe I could supplement that question by asking, to what extent have you seen that the pathways that they're on are being deliberate strategic decisions that are kind of informed by the sort of understandings that you're describing, or is this more descriptive of what you've seen they've ended up doing, but it's not so obvious that they were a well thought out strategic decision up front that led them down whichever path or paths that they're on?
It's a great question. Thank you, Peter and Paula. The bottom line is that when we do workshops with companies, we ask them, what pathways does it feel like you're on? And we give them 6 options, each of the 4, or multiple pathways well coordinated and multiple pathways not well coordinated. And that last answer is quite popular, right? And so one of the things we would recommend, to Paula's point, is having a common language and an agreed upon approach to which pathway is the best predictor of success. And companies that are on multiple pathways not coordinated have the worst outcomes in terms of % complete in their transformation. So that explicit stop, talk about it, agree, then we know where we're going is critical.
Great. And you mentioned something there in that description, which we haven't talked about for a while. And I wondered if we could get an update on it. A couple of years ago, before the pandemic in 2018, you and your colleague Stephanie Werner had published a book, What's Your Digital Business Model? You talked in that, and you mentioned again just now the value that can be created as an ecosystem driver, and that you argued then, I think, that was the most successful business model. Is that still true? What does it mean? What does it take to do that? Has that changed at all in the last couple of years with the rush to digitalization? Does it work for everyone, or is that only a particular kind of company that can really become an ecosystem driver?
It's a great question. We're just collecting new data right now, but the data that we have and the experience, we've got data from more than 1,000 companies. Ecosystem drivers, so these are companies that are go-to destinations for their customers' needs, but then they partner with people who can provide additional services, and then they manage the customer experience through a single sign-on and make sure that the experience is good. So Amazon was one of the first, but the Bayer Climate Field View is a good example. In Australia, we have a company called domain.com.au, which is for people who want to buy a house, and it provides the whole journey of dreaming about buying a house and starting to save, right through the 5 stages to moving in and post move in. And they are the go-to destination. They have partners with realtors, with mortgage providers, with insurance firms, with all kinds of services to help make that process easier. It's a similar business model to Zillow, probably got a few more features if you're in the US. And so Fidelity also has go-to destinations for both their B2B and B2C businesses very successfully. So Ping An in China, one of the most amazing financial services firms, has something called Good Doctor, which is a go-to destination for healthcare. the last numbers I just was reading last night is that something like 1 million consultations a day through this ecosystem, and partnerships with hospitals and pharmacies and testing sites to have a go-to destination. So it's absolutely possible. It's a bit of a winners takes most model because it's hard to be successful as an ecosystem, but it's also very, very powerful when you do. And so we're seeing many companies, if you like, buy the option for an ecosystem. And many of them have also been quite successful. And I think that we're seeing all kinds of ecosystems developing. Another one of my favorites is TradeLens, which is a partnership with Maersk and IBM to simplify the incredibly complex world of container shipping and shipping in general. You know, such a big issue right now in COVID and post-COVID. Something like 50% of the shipping volume goes through TradeLens today. So these ecosystems are very important. They're going to be dominant in industries. There's going to be one or two that are dominant in each industry. But a very successful model, nearly as successful, not quite, is to be a modular producer or a provider of capability into other people's ecosystems. So PayPal is a great example of that. And but you can think of a bank today. They could be banking as a service, embedded their banking services into other people's offerings that have the relationship with the customer. So TradeLens is starting to offer trade finance, so financial services embedded into that platform. So we think that those two models of ecosystems, the driver, being the go-to destination, but as well the modular, we call a modular producer, a plug and play capability that allows you to provide services into anyone else's ecosystem, is also a very powerful model.
That's this is really fascinating, and I think I heard you say there that there's some suggestion that being a first or a very early mover is advantageous, but I think you also suggested some examples where that first movement is not necessarily betting on the farm, but finding ways to be a first mover without actually putting yourself out of business in the process.
One of the big challenges when you do that is, do you add complementary products? That's usually relatively straightforward. But do you add competitor products to that platform? That's much more challenging. And so ecosystem models will test your will in terms of what you're willing to change, and particularly, and that's why we see a lot of ecosystem models as path 4 kind of approaches, because they can run them as a separate entity. So not only do they have a different culture of the unit, they're born digital, they're platform based, they're very, very fast, but also they have a different business model, different risk profile, and often they are connected. So domain.com.au, the example I gave earlier of the real estate company, came out of a media company, as a path 4 kind of approach. So I think one of the great dilemmas for boards and top management teams today is, what's the business model for them going forwards when ecosystems are starting to really take hold in each industry? And to be fair, let's give the other side of the equation. There is some pushback to global platform ecosystems. And so we're starting to see local solutions by country as well. So there's a lot more opportunities to have an ecosystem in a country as opposed to a global platform. And there'll be lots of regulations to encourage that, I expect, going forwards.
Right, that's an interesting point. I'm not sure whether you've been able to do this research yet, but the extent to which other social and public sector kind of responses and policy responses may be a whole additional factor in these developments that maybe many of the companies who are driving these developments haven't had to grapple with yet.
No, and we're seeing it every day in the headlines, as companies, as countries protect their citizens, regulate, but also try to enable innovation. It's not an easy balance, and regulators are learning, like the rest of us, about how to do this. I would recommend to the people listening to look at the research of my colleague at MIT, Sinan Aral, A-R-A-L. He's done a lot of research, has a great book on, particularly on social media, but digital in general, and the whole regulations and business models around it. It's great work.
Right. Maybe on that theme, sort of talking about trends, I've heard you often divide sort of into different segments here between trends that board members are facing, trends that their top management teams, who are the executives as opposed to the non-executives, are facing. And indeed, you mentioned a couple of times when we've been talking today, tech leaders as a category themselves obviously overlap with those other two, but not completely. What are some of the trends that you're seeing at the moment for those three groups?
Yeah, let's start with boards. I think the hardest change boards have to make, particularly with chairs of boards, is agendaing. How do we free up enough time to have the strategic conversations, to understand the big picture, to educate ourselves? And if we spend most of our time on compliance and on another very important responsibility of boards, which is to fiduciary responsibility, to make sure that projects are going well, we don't have enough time. And so one of the things we have looked at is, how can you automate in a dashboard the performance of the company, of the transformation, so that there's not endless presentations about those, but rather much better focused questions. And so balancing the agenda away from that compliance and oversight, obviously without giving it up, and focusing more on the strategic and some of the really difficult defensive things like cyber, I think is one of the big challenges of boards. And so how do you recruit people onto boards that can help you do that? There's a huge demand at the moment for digitally savvy board members, and we're seeing dual careers with CIOs, CTOs sitting on boards while serving as an acting CIO, or going out of their day-to-day executive role and doing a portfolio of boards. Several of members of MIT CISR have moved, CIOs have moved into that career, both double hatting as well as a portfolio model. And another really important element of boards is advisory committees. How do we get a way, to step up very quickly? And so a lot of work being done on how to have advisory committees that are effective. So I think that's one big trend for boards. For top management teams, I think a hugely important responsibility is not only to increase the digitally savviness of the whole company and themselves, but sort of walk the talk, be a different kind of leader, moving from the sort of hierarchy, command and control, to coach and communicate. But I also think one of the biggest challenges is solving the organizational Rubik's Cube, we call it. This is our newest research. How do you get all at the same time, focus on the customer, shared capability, modular components that are reused across the company, and also how do we take services that we're really good at and unlock those to be a new business? We call it X as a service. And we're seeing a lot of organizations figure that out in financial services, selling payments as a service, or KYC, but also lots of other things. And finally, for tech leaders, I mentioned the beyond alignment idea. I think we have to get beyond that, and we all will become platform-based companies in one way or another. We're all going to need to be better at digital partnering, and I think that's something that tech leaders can help with. I also think how we organize the tech capability in companies is changing a lot. The whole idea of a single IT unit is starting to be tested. And the dual careers I talked about. So I think for tech leaders, it's a particularly rosy future right now.
So that's a lot about people. You know, we've been talking for the last hour about organizations in many ways, but you know, we finished there with saying really it's about the the people as people. So you know, you're a person, Peter. What's your journey been like? How what's been your hardest change in becoming digital?
Yeah. I'm someone who used to travel pretty much every week for 20 years and then suddenly didn't. And by kind of objective measures, I'm way more productive, in terms of, papers and presentations and things like that. So I think understanding and how that future balance is going to be, I think we're going to live in hybrid worlds going forwards. I think running, you and I have talked about that in your organization and mine, and it's not an easy balance. So I think that's number one. Number two is the whole idea of, I mentioned it earlier, not having the answer where the world is so fast change. So how do we get the data to be able to answer it? I think that's been a big challenge for me personally, to move from that, trying to have an answer, to asking questions. And also, I think, figuring out collaboration in a digital world, I still think we've got a long way to go. I think that's, for me, a personal journey I'm still on.
Well, I think you're further ahead in the journey than you might be giving yourself credit for in that answer. But that said, there are others that are following behind. But it seems like this is all a driver of competitive advantage. And so one obvious question is, what happens when everyone else catches up?
Yeah. So today, there's no question in our minds and in our data that being digitally savvy is a competitive advantage. And being future ready as a company is a competitive advantage. And so in closing the book, one of the things we pondered was, so what happens when everyone's future ready and everyone's digitally savvy? Well, it turns out that being future ready is relative to competitors, and you'll never get there, right? I mean, by definition, the term. And so the best you can do is set a date for which you want to be future ready and digitally savvy, and make progress and measure getting to it. The problem, of course, is the goalposts shift and the bar raises, and what was digitally savvy today is different 3 years from now. But it does get easier, I think. What I do think is hard is the whole change agenda, coping with that level of change. And that pathway one, that exponential curve, that's how all of us feel, I think. And so I don't think we'll ever be future ready, but I think we have to set realistic targets, make it, and then do it again. And I think that's true for us personally, Peter.
So that pathway one, that exponential curve, we could go into a whole discussion about exponentials and
We could.
how they come to be. But I hear what you're saying is that curve's just going to be getting further and further away from us if we don't figure out how to stay on it and indeed get ahead of it ourselves.
Precisely, yeah. And the master of the exponential curves, a former colleague of ours, Ray Kurzweil, will tell you that the steeper you go, the faster the change. But if you don't start, you can't make progress. So it's probably a great place to end.
Absolutely. Well, maybe we could end just by sharing final thoughts on what else can people do to get started? How else can we MIT help them? Maybe
Yeah.
some other people watching might already be CISR members, but if they're not, perhaps that would be something that they could look into.
I think so. I think we'd love to have more members at MIT CISR. I think the certificate programs that you run and your team runs at MIT Sloan Executive Education have just been an amazing contribution where you can take multiple courses and get a certificate. You must have seen interest in that. And also you've pioneered online learning as well. I mean, actually, Peter, a question for you. What's been your lesson learned in the increasing not only digitally savvy but savvy in general in an online world?
Yeah, I was tempted to comment earlier. It's often quite challenging having these conversations with you on camera because I find myself thinking about what this all means for us and the journeys that we've been on, and I should be thinking much more about the people watching rather than myself. But I mean, to give a couple of examples, before the pandemic, from our sort of experimentation in going into sort of fully digital programs, which a lot of us in the industry, from a learning point of view, always were not so sure that you could get the outcomes from that we're used to getting, in traditional classrooms, and particularly with very senior executives. In fact, we turned around and within the space of 2-3 years, 25% of the revenue that we were generating was from fully digital programs before the pandemic. And that raised a lot of the questions that you're talking about, including these Rubik's cubes. I love that metaphor. How do we do all these things in simultaneously? We'd not kill any geese that are laying golden eggs for us at the moment, but also really prepare ourselves to be able to not only respond to, but in some sense be driving the innovation. And for us at MIT, and I think for some people watching, if you're in an organization where the world and the market expects you to be innovative, then that doesn't happen by accident.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that solving of the organizational Rubik's Cube, and we have a lovely picture of it, that is one of the big management challenges going forwards. And so just to reiterate, you've got to be able to identify the customer types you're after. You've got to be able to identify what are the common capabilities to serve those customer types. You've got to be able to identify the reusable modules that plug and play. And you've got to be able to sell what you're great at as a service. And so that solving of the Rubik's Cube is really challenging. And I thought I'd finish with a funny slide. So I don't have the builds. Sorry. So I have a bunch of builds about different kinds of Rubik's Cubes. And this was the last one. And this is where some organizations would tell you this is our version of the Rubik's Cube, right? We've got a core, but pieces all over the place. They're not connected. And every time we try and move it, pieces fall off. And I think that's the challenge and the goal going forwards is to be more like this. The customer type, capabilities of service, commercializing and embedded modules. And I think all of us as leaders, and I hear you saying it, are struggling with getting that right.
Another way of looking at those two pictures that you've just shown would be, yes, different ways of solving the Rubik's Cube. One is moving them around the different axes and trying to get all of the faces aligning. The other, which when I was a kid in the 1980s, many people became expert in, found it much quicker just to pull all the pieces out and put them back in the right place, or what they thought was the right place.
Yep. Yeah. Or you can pull the stickers off, right?
So some true creativity coming there. Well, Peter, an hour and more has flown by. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, especially, I know it's not an ideal time of day in some part of the world or another part of the world. And I know we've had people joining us from all over the world as well. So thank you all for joining us live. Also, I know many people watch these recordings after the fact. And so please do feel free to keep in touch with us, send us questions via LinkedIn or via our website. We love to hear from everyone about your experience with these events, and of course also ways that we, in particular in MIT Sloan's executive education program, can make sure we're understanding what all of you out there need us to be doing to help you to be successful, because that's what we would like to be doing more of. Thank you again, Peter. It's always a pleasure. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for the team behind the stage here who have undoubtedly made this a smooth and successful experience for the two of us on this virtual stage as well. So thank you to those of you backstage.
Thanks, Peter. Bye, everybody.